In a desolate truck stop beside a highway, a trucker heard strange knocks and hisses in the deep night. What did he encounter that made the night so terrifying? What secrets are hidden behind the lizards he heard? Explore the unknown, subscribe without pause. Don't miss an episode, click subscribe to join our adventure. This took place about 7 years ago, and it's been haunting me ever since. I've been a trucker for over a decade now, and you hear all sorts of stories on the road, but this one it still gives me the chills. So I was driving through a particularly desolate stretch of highway in the Midwest when I decided to pull over at a truck stop for the night. The place was pretty run down and there was only a few other trucks parked there. As I was getting ready to settle in, I overheard a couple of guys talking near one of the trucks. They seemed on edge, whispering urgently. I caught snippets of their conversation and heard one of them say, "Watch out for the lizards." I thought that was a weird thing to say, but I didn't think much of it at the time. I figured that it was some sort of local slang or an inside joke. As the night wore on, though, I started to drift off, but then I heard footsteps crunching on the gravel outside. It was strange too, because it didn't sound just like one person. It was like a small group was walking around, but the pattern was irregular and unsettling to say the least. Curiosity got the better of me eventually, so I peeked out of my window. I couldn't see much in the dim light, but there were definitely figures moving around the parking area. They seemed to be skulking between the trucks, almost like they were looking for something. I told myself that it was probably just other drivers stretching their legs, but for whatever reason, the unease just wouldn't go away. Suddenly, though, I heard a sharp knock on my door. My heart leapt into my throat at that. I glanced at the clock and it was well past midnight. I called out asking who it was, but there was no response, just the sound of footsteps shuffling away. I was too spooked to investigate further, so I locked my doors and I just tried to get some sleep. Now, just as I was drifting off again, I heard a low sort of hissing sound coming from somewhere nearby. It was faint but persistent, like somebody whispering just out of earshot. I squeezed my eyes shut, then told myself that it was just my imagination, but then I heard the footsteps again closer. This time, throughout the night, I could hear knocks and scratches on the other trucks around me as well. Every once in a while, there was some sort of yelling or moaning coming from the distance, like someone or something was trying to communicate or call out. Occasionally there was a smoky smell too, like a cigarette would waft through the air. When these things or whoever was out there were close to my truck. The rest of the night was a blur of eerie sounds and well-creeping dread. I kept telling myself that it was just some weird local prank, but I don't know about that anymore. The whole thing felt very off as soon as the first light of dawn broke. I didn't waste a second. I fired up my truck and I got out of there without even looking back. I did not want to see what might have been left in the morning, and to this day, I just cannot shake the feeling that there was something more to those lizards than meets the eye. Who knows? Maybe it was just an overactive imagination, or maybe there's something out there in those backwood truck stops that we are just better off not knowing about. Whatever the case. Stay safe out there and keep your eyes and ears open, because you just never know who or what might be lurking in the dark out there. This happened about 13 years ago. I was in my early 20s at the time, so to preface this, while growing up, my sister and I had many encounters that you could consider supernatural. I suppose her more so than me. She seemed to be harassed by spirits often, and sometimes I shared some of those encounters too. Now, several years ago, after moving out of home, I went to visit my family, and we were staying the night at my grandparents' parents' place. It was a normal day, nothing out of the ordinary. I went to bed that night, my sister and I sleeping in different rooms. I dreamt I was laying in bed, a different bed in the dream, no recollection of what the room looked like, when suddenly an intense feeling of like despair just washed over me. But it was worse than that. Like every positive feeling in the world was erased, and I was left with this overwhelming pressure of all the negativity and I started crying. I rarely cry, and, as hilarious as this example might be, think of the effect the Dementors from Harry Potter have on people. In the dream I rolled over, and a red dome had encased the bed, and a black hooded figure stood at the end of the bed holding a scroll in his hand. At this point I lost it and started screaming in fear. I screamed so loud that the red dome split open, as I woke myself up from my own screams. My dad came into the room and asked if that was me making the noise. I just mumbled, "Yeah, I think so." Eventually I went back to sleep, and that was that for the night now. The next morning I went to tell my sister about my dream, and she said, "Before you tell me that, I need to tell you something that happened to me last night." You see, I couldn't get to sleep, and suddenly I noticed a person standing at the end of the bed holding a piece of paper in their hand at that. I was terrified, too scared to sleep for the next few nights, but nothing else ever happened like that since then, which is strange, right? It definitely put me on edge for a while, but thankfully nothing else happened. It was a random day, and my family and I had a trip planned out to go somewhere far from home. It was to go to a place in the Philippines, and while on the way we used a GPS tracker to reach our destination. None of us were aware that the GPS may not be actually accurate, but we followed the route anyway. My uncle was driving the car that day. It was a Fortune car big enough to fit many people inside. As we were making our way there, it was still sunset, and we were going up a hill surrounded by tall trees. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep for a while because I was pretty exhausted from all the journey that we went through to just get here. But I soon woke up to my mother's voice saying, "Be careful, we are going to fall off." I looked around the car window, and we were on top of a hill. Now the sides of the road were so thin and tight, one wrong turn, and we would all come crashing down. My cousins and I were at the back of the car, but we stayed quiet because we knew that to panic in a situation like this was going to be very unhelpful. My mom was the only one panicking, and as we went further, my uncle drove slowly, and thankfully we didn't fall off and managed to find an area that we could turn and make a U-turn. It was still on the hill, mind you, but the area was wide enough. Now, after making it back to the main road safely, we were all pretty shaken, scared. Even now, fast forward a bit after that, it was night time. Obviously there was nothing in sight, no lights, and it was just pretty much blackness, and nothing all around us, my family. They didn't follow the GPS this time, they used their memories because they'd used a different road before. Apparently we were going up a hill again, and I had no idea where it was, but all I saw were trees around the car and the quiet sounds of the car wheels driving over the gravel. Then at some point we stopped, and I was confused by that, but it appeared that there was no continuation of the road ahead. Everyone in the car was quiet. Now my mother asked my uncle to check outside when they opened the car door. It was really cold, the wind was strong, and I heard the trees. It was really spooky, and it sent a bit of a chill down my spine. My uncle closed the door as he turned on the front lights of the car, and there all of a sudden was a line of people, lots of them. I don't have any idea what they were doing alone in the woods there, and it was so weird. Weird. We quickly backed out of there, and we made our way back home after that. After that too, I fell asleep from exhaustion. I think I hadn't eaten all day, because we were stranded in the woods, and the next thing I know I woke up, and we were already on the main road and stopped by a 7-Eleven shop. They bought some hot dogs for my cousin and I to eat. All of us were starving and had no energy at this stage. I'm glad my family and I were safe, but I guess it's just a reminder that if you want to go somewhere, don't always trust the GPS or the maps, because routes are definitely outdated at times, and in our case that was definitely what happened. Still, though, what those people were doing up at that mountain in the cold like that, out in the dark, with no light, I have no idea. I was 20 at the time, home alone at my family's rural house, with one of my high school buddies who lived with us at the time. He was 18, and importantly, there were no cars in the driveway, so the house appeared to be unoccupied. Now my buddy is short, skinny, baby-faced and eternally looks like a middle schooler. But he's a grown man, who can hold his own in a fight. A lifted grey Julie quad cab, with a spot of white primer, where a company logo would have been pulls into our driveway. I don't recognize it or anyone in it. They stop and 3 dudes hop out of the truck. The driver has a semi-automatic in a holster on his hip too. They had to drive past our no soliciting no trespassing sign. Violators may be shot to get where they were at. I'm observing this through the crack in the blinds in the living room window. My buddy was around back pretending to be a blacksmith, with our homemade charcoal forge. He came around the side of the house while I was observing. I couldn't hear, but I could see body language. I noticed my buddy was holding the hammer in a very specific way so that he could whip it around his shoulder and throw it like Thor if he needed to. This told me that my buddy also had no idea who these people were. That I grabbed his dear rifle off of the living room coffee table, silly place to store a gun. I know, but that's where it was, slammed a single round into the chamber and aimed through the slit in the blinds at the armed trespasser. Jumping now to my buddy's perspective. Here's how the conversation went. Hey there, kid. Are your parents home? Where are some local ranchers going door to selling fresh cuts? Yeah, my dad's inside getting ready to go shooting. He's got plenty of meat, but my uncle might want some. Let me call him, to which my buddy pulled out his phone and called 911. After a moment the trespassers realized the cops were coming and got back in their truck and they left pretty quickly. I found out later that the truck was actually stolen, and we had a run-in with the group that was responsible for over 30 break-ins over the past few months, some of them pretty violent. I just woke up in the middle of the night remembering this and I need to get it off my chest. So when I was 16, my dad, brothers and I lived in an old run-down house pretty much in the middle of nowhere. It was a private rental. My brother would do work for the landlord to pay our rent. Our landlord never came off as particularly creepy or anything, but that could be because I rarely went outside when he came over to talk to my dad, and he wouldn't dare do anything in front of my dad. But anyway, I was home alone one day and my dad and brothers went out somewhere. I really don't remember where, but I had my dog in a fenced-in yard outside, but that was it. I was in my room doing whatever I was doing, probably playing The Sims 2 at the time. We lived in the middle of nowhere, like I said, and there was a long driveway which the window of my bedroom directly faced. I could see or hear anyone driving up the driveway at any point. I saw a car, but not my dad's, and immediately began to get a bit freaked out. I ran and shut all the blinds in the house, turned off all the lights and checked the doors were locked, but it was our landlord. He lived next door, about 2 miles away from our house, and yes, that was the closest house. This wasn't the first time that he come here unexpectedly. It had happened twice before and both times I was home alone. Those first 2 times he was only there for about 10 minutes, walking around the outside of the house and then quickly leaving. But this time was different. I could sense that something was wrong, so I grabbed a big kitchen knife and hid under the kitchen table. I heard him pull up outside and open our front gate. My dog outside was going ballistic and barking. I heard him yell, "Shut up, mutt." I could hear his footsteps walking up to the door. He tried to open the door, and I was freaking out at this point. I texted my dad too. He was coming straight home, but they'd be like an hour still. He continued to walk around the outside of our house, trying to peek into each window. The house is old and has 3 doors that you can enter from the outside from. He tried to open all 3. I thought that maybe he didn't know I was home. Maybe the last 2 times were a coincidence, but he started saying things, including calling out my name, which means that he knew that I was home alone. I couldn't hear what else he was saying through the double brick walls, but I quietly creeped through the house, following his voice up and down the hallway. I was trying to hear what he was saying, and that's when he said something that I'll never forget. I'm going to burn the house down, but I'll let you out first. Of course, I didn't take him seriously, which scares me even more now that I think about it, but he wanted me to come out. He wanted me to take his threat seriously, and that's the part that really gets to me. I know exactly what could have happened if I had believed him, and my life would have been, well, completely different. He was there for at least 30 minutes to maybe closer to an hour in fact, and I mean he was very persistent. He left before my dad came home, and I told him everything, and we moved out soon after this. I still don't know how he knew that I was home alone too. My dad never saw him on the way driving out, so he knew my dad was gone because there was no car in the driveway. But how did he know that I wasn't with him? The whole thing was creepy, and in fact I'm just realizing now that I think we were evicted in the end. We didn't leave. We lived in a caravan at my uncle's house for a year before finding a house in a different town in the end, and to be honest, I was happier to be there in that caravan and in that house. This is by far the weirdest thing that has ever happened to me, and genuinely I have no idea what to think about it. So 14 years ago a group of friends and I were hanging outside and eating pizza on top of our friend's car when we all saw what looked like a monkey swinging high in the trees a good distance away. We lived in GA and I joke that one of the apes from the local zoo must have escaped, but there was definitely an uneasy feeling amongst us. Everything was quiet too, and on this warm G day we live in an area with a lot of water. There's lots of insects, but everything just felt quiet, and still all of a sudden the ape then stopped swinging from the trees, and even though it was really large, a black figure, we could just tell that it was sort of looking at us. Then the ape started straightening its posture, looking more human and less like a primate. It was unsettling to say the least. We all just stood there, sort of frozen and watching. Suddenly the man seemed to turn around and crouch down, but as he was crouching down, his shoulder blades were getting impossibly larger, growing over his head, before huge wings sort of sprang from its back out of nowhere, and it jumped off the branch and flew off even from a distance. We could tell that this thing was absolutely huge too. At that moment, it was like the spell that we were under broke, and we all scrambled to get back into the car screaming. I didn't sleep that night. I felt like whatever it was had followed me home, and was watching all night. I'm sure that it probably wasn't, but I was terrified. Honestly too. I definitely wouldn't have believed it if 3 other people hadn't seen it also that night, and it's just one of the weirdest things that's ever happened to me, and something I'll never forget. I've had quite a few weird and paranormal experiences in my life, but that one is by far one of the most terrifying, weird and memorable ones yet. So I moved into this house with my family, mom, dad, 2 sisters, 2 dogs about 8 years ago. I was 10 at the time, and my sisters were 12 and 15. Some of my neighbors' kids went to our school too, and were in the same grade as my 12-year-old sister. At the time, trigger warning here, but they told us that the son of the family, who lived here before us, had actually ended his own life in our garage as a kid. I very much believe that too. They even went as far as to say that's why the handprints are there, which always freaked me out, because on our garage door there is a set of handprints on the side that just never seem to come off anyway. Fast forward, a few years later, my dad planted some purple tulips in the front for my mom, because she has epilepsy, and that's the representative color. She had always mentioned how she felt bad replacing the yellow ones that were there previously for the sun. I had no idea that it had any sort of significance until she would always say that the story was just so tragic that she could only tell us everything. When we were older, she always got a little bit choked up talking about it too. Over the years, weird things had started happening though. I would hear footsteps when I was home alone with my dogs beside me. My dogs will randomly begin barking into my sister's room, which used to belong to the son. Apparently the dogs refused to go into that room. At times I would hear knocks on my door, but nobody was there. My hangers were all flipped up in the closet at one point, and one even started moving on its own, with no fans on or anything. Something about my sister's room had always freaked me out too, and my sister had even said that she purposefully falls asleep in mine or my other sister's room, because that room terrifies her. It was in the basement. She even said that while away at college or anywhere else, she was fine, but something about that room gives her sleep paralysis, and the only way that she can describe it is like the barber do hiding in the corner watching her. Could this just be a ton of weird coincidences, or is there actually something here? My dad has 2 short paranormal experiences, from when he was around 20 years old and living with friends in a haunted flat that is now long demolished, that have always freaked me out. He lived with 4 friends in the late 70s, early 1880s, and were into the punk rock scene at the time, nights in the pub and all that. I do wonder if the stories could be related to drugs, but he insisted that he never took them personally. And one night a girlfriend of one of the roomies was staying in the flat alone, whilst the rest went to the pub. And later that night she came crying into the pub to find them, saying that there were voices coming from inside the flat with her. This was the first hint that something creepy was happening in that flat, and his standout story, however, is pretty brief. But he was sleeping on the sofa one night, woke up, and saw a person with no eyes leaning over the back of the sofa. Looking down at him, he said that he was frozen in fear, and it disappeared after a few seconds. It wasn't his roommates and he didn't recognize the person at all. His other experience was when he was younger, around 15, when he was living at my grandparents' house, and this story has always got to me. So one night when my grandparents or his parents were out, he walked out of the front room to go upstairs to go to the toilet, and he swears that he saw a naked man, wet, skinned, with no arms, long damp black hair, down below the shoulder level, stood at the top of the stairs in the light, looking down before just disappearing. He never told his parents this because he didn't want to scare them, but he told me a few years ago, when I told him about some of my minor experiences. I have visited that house a few times since my dad told me the story, and when I stand at the bottom of those stairs and look up, I can't help but feel a scary chill run down my spine, imagining what my dad saw when he was young. He hasn't seen anything since then, and is now almost 70. I think he's definitely not one to make up stories, and his other roommates also had experiences in that flat too, though minor compared to what he experienced. I struggle to recall some of the other stories, but to be honest, my dad's ones are definitely the ones that stand out the most. I live alone with my mom in a relatively nice area in a section of the house our friend owns. I have some anxiety issues from a stalking incident in a prior area of town, so sometimes paranoia gets the best of me, but I'm able to use logic to reason my way out of it 9 of the time now. Our friend frequently travels and my mom has had health issues recently. Every person who lives here has to go outside and go through storm doors to the basement to access the laundry, and we have motion sensors through the basement and yard to help us see as we are walking. My front door, it has a small window with a broken blind or two. So there's small peas, and they just happened about an hour ago, and honestly I'm still a bit shaken by the whole thing. So our housemate is traveling and my mom felt ill enough earlier that I told her to go to an emergency room and make sure nothing serious was happening, and I was left by myself, which isn't too uncommon here. I'd been doing my normal routines when I remembered that there was laundry in the dryer, so I got up and walked down my steps into the basement, and I had left the storm doors open. Now was where you'd think that the story would start, but surprisingly my laundry routine went fine. I closed the storm doors and proceeded back up to the stairs to my section of the home. I had to pee really bad, so the second that I closed the door, I placed the bin down and had the thought to lock my door tonight, something I don't tend to do in fact, because my mom is a smoker and hearing the locks at night, well, it's pretty loud and it'll wake me up a lot, but anyway, if I hadn't, that could have been a huge mistake. That night I used the bathroom, and ended up taking a bit longer than I needed to scrolling around social media. I remember all the clean clothes, so I strip mostly naked, besides underwear, and I throw on a pair of shorts, and as I grab a shirt to throw on, my heart, brain, gut and everything all of a sudden just screams. Door now locks in that second. Thankfully, my buddy responded and took the 2 steps towards the door. I tried to lock it, but the doorknob wouldn't move. That only ever happens if the knob is being turned, and I know for a fact that I wasn't turning it. I locked the secondary lock and slammed my back into the door, waiting for a minute to test the doorknob lock again, hoping that it would work this time. Thankfully this time it did, and while I hadn't noticed at first, the motion sensor light had activated far too long after I was inside for me to have done it. And I mean there are such terrible lights, I have to wave my hands in front of them occasionally to activate them. So I'm like 95% sure that somebody was out there. That night, I sat with my back to the door for who knows how long before I got up and turned most of the lights off, grabbed a knife that I had next to me all night. I looked out both windows that direction after a while and I saw nothing. Luckily, I guess, because honestly I don't know what I would have done if I had seen someone. I really don't know what to do about all of this, but I am almost certain that there was someone there that night, someone with bad intentions. 2 nights back, I had an experience with something in the wooded areas around the Maple Lake in Illinois. At the Overlook, I tried to do my research on what it could have been. I came across encounters of other cryptids like skinwalkers and wendigo. However, the suburban nature of this encounter has led me to disqualify the possibility of it being either one of those creatures, and its appearance and location has led me to believe that it may be what is regarded as a crawler. I don't know what it was, but it was something that felt human, but I know it couldn't have been a human. It felt too much like an animal. It still hit me like I was being watched by an animal too. It just took longer for me to catch on than I usually do, I suppose, anyway. So I'm there off the main streets in the southwestern suburbs at the Overlook, listening to music in my car. I often like to get out of the city just to clear my head, and I feel like I heard something pulling up to me from behind. You know it's late. It's dark. People like to come to the Overlook to drink or find some privacy. So I check my rearview mirror, and that's when I see it in the moonlight. Something is in the shadows across the road up the hill. I'm unsure of exactly what it is. I move to adjust my mirror, to get a better look when I see eyes like how animals have eyes that glisten in the dark. It's like that. But they are watching me through the review mirror transfixed, focused intent, like the way people do in photographs. It looked like what I now imagine is the devil of some kind, tall and white, as snow it froze me in place. It had straightforward eyes like predators do. That's all I got to look at, as it was sleeped up against and behind the trees. My head, I guess, finally processed what I was seeing and I get hit like someone poured ice down my back. That feeling I get when someone is approaching me from behind or something is watching me. This sends me absolutely bugging out into panic. So I shift into drive and hook a right forward and out of the lot back onto the main road running along the hill. I speed up and head forward. I just drive until I hit the main road with street lights again, and I don't stop until I get back out of the surrounding preserves area. The eyes, they just felt so human though, but it felt impossible for someone to be out there. But I know it just couldn't have been an animal, because when I'm out in the preserves it never felt like that. When I was among deer or the other animals that I know are out there, whatever it was, it felt wrong, like it was invading the space, but it didn't feel like a person, exactly like the feeling you get when a person is around. That you sort of know. I keep my guard up pretty well when I'm out alone, but whatever it was, it flew beneath my senses, and fit into the dark pretty quickly again. I don't know what it was, but it made me feel so sick that I was there and I missed it like I didn't know it was there until I fully registered. Something was out there with me. If anyone has any idea as to what it could have been, then please to give me a better understanding. I'm willing to talk or listen. I've been a skeptic as long as I've run in circles amongst my fellow outdoors people, but this encounter, it has quickly turned my perception of the natural and unnatural upside down. This happened about 15 years ago, at a ranch-style house in the middle of the country, surrounded by farmland and sparely spaced houses. I haven't talked to my dad in years, and while he claimed to be religious, he more so thought that he was than him actually being religious. I've been a very headstrong skeptic, was a typical teenage atheist and still am an atheist, I suppose, but have become more spiritual in my late 20s and 30s. Or at least open to it, I guess so. My dad and I were home and he was in his office room with the radio very loud, and I was in the living room working on college work. My dad he can't hear very well at all. However, we both heard the kitchen door open with a pop and sort of squeaking kind of sound, which was the typical sound when opened work boots stomping on the kitchen floor. We all wore work boots because we were outside laborious and walked heavy, and the sound of both the work boots being taken off and being dropped on the kitchen floor, which is what my dad, little brother, and I did, in a very common noise. My dad and I both heard it and figured it was my little brother coming home. However, the outside free-roaming dogs hadn't barked and the driveway alarms didn't go off. Maybe the dogs were out roaming, or maybe the driveway just didn't pick up the car. That's how he tried to rationalize it anyway. So I called my little brother, and he was 45 minutes away still. My dad and I searched outside the entire house, ground floor and basement, every room, and it was just us like I said. I'm not religious, but something just isn't right about that house like at all, and a decade plus later my little brother still swears that it wasn't him. He has story about seeing shadow people for years and something following him on and in his car, as well, and many more stories, but my eyes water, and I get goosebumps every time that I share this. Even all these years later many weird or questionable things happened in that house too. My older sister swears that she saw what she thought was my little brother when he was just a toddler, but it turns out that it was like a light figure, something during the middle of the night when she got up to. She thought that she saw my little brother in the hallway by the bathroom. At one point it wasn't my little brother though. She locked herself in the bathroom and wouldn't come out until someone woke up and knocked on the door. This was like 20 plus years ago, and eventually she got older and she wouldn't talk about it anymore, but for the longest time. When asked about the story, she would always say the exact same thing. And again, when I share this, I have to admit that it's a little creepy. When I was about 6 years old, I stayed at my grandmother's quite frequently. She lived in a mobile home, or trailer I guess you could call it, and the washroom and living room were on opposite sides of the trailer. And one day I walked to the end of the hallway to use the washroom, and when I looked inside to find the light switch and turn it on, I saw my cousin, who sometimes visits. My grandma looked me directly in the eye and put a finger up to her lips like a shush sound, but she was completely silent. She then got on her hands and knees and crawled behind the counter and out of sight. I felt a feeling of dread and instantly knew that this wasn't my cousin, or even a human being for that matter. I took off running and screaming for my grandma. We searched the entire trailer together, but it was only us in there. While we searched, I told her that I'd seen my cousin in there and she told me not to be silly. My cousin is not visiting town and she's home, which is a couple of hours driveway to this day. I don't know what I saw, or why I saw it, or why it made the shush gesture, but the whole thing. It has sat with me all these years later. So last night, on the baby monitor, I saw a hand gently patting my 4-month-old son's belly when he was crying to console him. This isn't the first time too. We don't have squatters, we don't have attic access to any of the bedrooms. We have 2 dogs and we both work from home. We would know if somebody else was secretly living with us. But anyway, back towards the end of May, my son was taking a nap in his bassinet in our room. He's just a baby, so he naps frequently throughout the day. This was probably about 5:00 p.m., I would guess. My wife and I were on the deck outside grilling, and had the baby monitor out with us. He was starting to wake up and was fussing a bit, so she went inside to go to the bathroom before getting him upstairs. I was bringing food inside as she was walking out of the bathroom, and when she saw me, she stopped dead in her tracks, like she was absolutely shocked to see me. I jokingly said, "I live here too, you know," and that's when she told me that she just saw a hand on the baby upstairs. A second ago, when looking at the monitor in a sudden panic, when she realized that it wasn't me upstairs, we rushed up and didn't find anything or anyone in the room. When she told me it's not that I didn't believe her. I guess I was just trying over and over again to think of a logical explanation for what she saw, but nothing just ever made any sense. Now my first thought from an outsider's view would be, oh, this is common, and it's just a glitch showing a previous image on the screen or something. But this baby camera and monitor is just for a live feed. There's no recording or on-air memory or anything like that. The image is very clear and doesn't have visual effects or anything. If it is out of range, it just goes to a white screen stating the signal has been lost. It doesn't drop bit rate or get blurry or anything like that. I also am a videographer for a living, so I'm quite familiar with the concept of the artifacts or occasional compression glitch showing old footage that you would see on security cams that has onboard memory. But I can assure you that this was not that in the 4 years of owning and using these cameras for our 2 kids. That has never happened too. Anyway, fast forward to last night. About a month and a half after that first occurrence, our son now usually sleeps in his crib in his room until he wakes up to a feeding in the middle of the night. Last night at 3:00 a.m. on the dot, I heard him crying on the monitor right on my nightstand. I went on to my wife to bring him in, but she wasn't in bed. As I rolled back over to look at the monitor, I saw a hand come into frame from the side, gently pat him as he was crying for 2 soft pats on the belly, then leave the frame. I didn't think twice. I figured it was obviously my wife, and she was maybe prepping the changing table to change his diaper or something, which is why she had patted him instead of picking him up right away. But that was when my wife came out of the bathroom in our bedroom, confirming that she was not in his room across the house. I immediately stood up and said, "Oh my goodness, I thought it was you." As the adrenaline was rushing my body, I could barely speak. In fact, it's true when people say that when something happens like this, that they froze or couldn't speak or whatever. I was just completely choked up and had a hard time explaining what I meant. Again, we both went into his room and as far as we could tell, he was alone. Now what I don't get is if this is a ghost or a spirit or whatever. Why is it making itself seen? We have 2 cameras in the room, his baby monitor, and a blink camera on a shelf that we use just for live viewing, so we can't access previous cloud storage. That only triggers with motion 2 separate occasions of being seen. I feel like it goes against all of the stories that you would hear about spirits and cameras. Not an orb, not a light, but truly a physical hand. This spirit is seemingly friendly, I guess, because otherwise I feel like it wouldn't try to comfort our baby anyway. Has anyone experienced anything like this before? I'm trying not to overreact and take this experience as a guardian angel looking over our baby, but I'm not so sure about that and I would really appreciate some help. My ex and I were walking on a trail near my house one day, and around my area homeless people are known to frequent. Everything was pretty much part for the course until I walked off the path and onto what seemed to be a deer trail on earth. I saw a few deer at first, but later I heard what at first seemed to be voices. I assume that maybe a homeless community camp there or something. But we came across a deer where lowered its head and crown of antlers and continued walking toward us until it was maybe about 10 feet away, and then disappeared into the forest. Okay. So maybe the deer was sick or had a wasting disease or something still strange behavior for a wild animal. I kept hearing the voices until I realized that it was actually chanting at too low of a volume to register what the words were, and the deeper we walked down that deer trail, I realized that it couldn't be the homeless, as the chanting repeated itself. It was sort of on a loop, almost like the sounds were repeating, even if the words themselves weren't audible. And finally we came to what appeared to be a concrete tunnel at the end of the trail, and I had this odd feeling that if we didn't leave now, that we were about to die, not dread, but like terror. So we ran from that place, and while the looped chanting followed us down the trail, or while I felt like we were being watched. What I mean by that is that the sound of the chanting it didn't grow fainter from behind us as we ran, and it sort of stayed the same volume, as if whatever it was following us also. I didn't know this at the time, but later my ex told me that people apparently went missing there and some had even died there. I heard rumors throughout my life to avoid deer trails here, but I never thought that there was anything to it. I am still perplexed and I don't know what actually happened that night. When I was a kid, I lived in a house with my cousins until we eventually moved out. I had lived there until I was about 12 and I had a variety of experiences there. I know that they were real too, because my family has had similar experiences. My first encounter, well, it was while I was watching TV in my room. Suddenly the dresser in the hallway began making really loud banging noises. I unfortunately can't share images right now, as I'm out of country, but it was wooden and had large metal hoops to open the drawers in it. The sound was made by the metal hoops slamming against the wood. I could see them moving from where I was laying. Every time I would get up to look at it closer, though it would always stop. Obviously I was freaked out, and after a while of this pattern, it stopped and I just continued watching TV. It couldn't have been my sibling, or a cousin messing around with me too, as my family was out and my cousins were visiting family out of state. The second thing, though, that I can remember, was constantly hearing voices. They would always be in my mother's voice too, calling out either mine or siblings' names. It always happened when I was home alone, and once I went downstairs thinking my parents had come home, but there was no one. The only thing out of place was a teacup sitting on the table in the living room. The teacup brings to me another thing that happened once before as well. Nearly every night, I would hear cups sort of tinkering around together. I could tell it was the teacups too, since it made a sort of specific higher pitch sound that other cups wouldn't. I would go downstairs after hearing it sometimes, but nothing looked different. This final one was the last large experience that I had, and it occurred a few months after my grandfather's passing, so sometimes I would sleep in his room, as we were very close and it was comforting, and one night, while I was drifting off the cabinets in the room that would hold his medication, they began violently slamming and banging, but then I saw a figure in the hallway hunched over and convulsing. This image is literally burned into my memory from how horrific it was to a 9-year-old. In the end too, I just sort of covered my head in the blankets and eventually I must have fallen asleep. The next morning, I asked my parents about it and they said that they had heard the cabinets too, but they didn't see anything in the hallway like I had. So those are the stories that I can recall for now, and I'll probably share some more another time. But yeah, that house, there's something wrong with it and I'm glad that I don't live there anymore. So my co-worker came into work today and told me about her night. She was in bed and both her and her significant other smelled burning and heard crackling around 2 a.m. They both got out of bed to check it out. They figured it was the bug zapper outside. They went to turn it off and exited to the porch, where they both heard consistent bark from the field below. This field had no nearby houses or anything, and it's a bit of a trek to even get up their driveway. The bark was weird but sounded like a normal dog, aside from the fact that it was just consistent, almost rhythmic, in fact. They decided to go ahead and check out the field. They took a car down and as soon as the engine was cut, there was a pit all of a sudden in their stomachs exiting the car. It sounded like the bark was so far away now that even though they were right on top of it before, it just made no sense. It hadn't have seemed to have changed much, but it didn't sound as close as it did when they were in the house. My coworker decided that it wasn't a good idea to leave her child alone in the house for too long, and so in the end she went back. About a half an hour passed and the dog is still consistently barking in the field. Significant other decides to go back and make sure that there isn't a dog in the ditch, or something she decided to call him, so he wasn't just out there completely alone. Once he got back there, he started walking into the field trying to find it, the pit still in his stomach the whole time. He decided not to call out, but to just look instead. He left straps just in case as well. By the way, the entire time my co-worker listened on the phone, the barking grew more intense and the dog went crazy, as it had obviously seen the light from his phone or something. The weirdest thing, though, was that he saw nothing, but the barking continued to grow louder until he must have been right on top of it. She had commented at one point that it was so deafening. It sounded like the dog itself was holding the phone, but then all of a sudden, just dead silence. No running, no barking, no breathing, nothing, no dog found or anything. She messaged her father, who lives close by, and he had heard the barking too, but obviously didn't go to investigate. She had her father ask the person who owns the property to go and check out where they had heard what was going on too the next day. Nothing found so far, and it's been raining there, so there should be tracks. And I also decided to ask them if it sounded like a fox or a coyote, or anything. They lived down there long enough to distinguish between the two. And this sounded too much like a blunt hound to be anything else. So if you guys have any more ideas, then I would love to hear them for reference. We are in Ohio, so we are in Appalachia, and I know the place has a bit of a bad reputation for stuff like this, but yeah, I hope that's helpful. So my boyfriend and I live in a small neighborhood. Our house faces a densely wooded riverfront. Our street isn't very busy, it's dark and there isn't a park in the woods or anything, so not many people go down there, much less the middle of the night. But last night at around midnight, my boyfriend was sitting on our front porch smoking a cigarette, when he heard a weird voice in the distance. It was clearly speaking a different language, and the only way that he could describe it was it sounded like Mickey Mouse. He thought that it was just some kids messing around with him, but as he listened closely, he noticed that it was just one voice talking and laughing. It wasn't talking to anyone except itself, whatever or whoever it was. It was far enough off in the distance that my boyfriend felt comfortable listening, until it started whistling an eerie song that he couldn't place, and as it whistled it began to grow closer. He ran inside and locked all the doors and the windows. He tried waking me up, but I get up at like 5:00 a.m. every morning for work and I sleep like a rock hearing about it, though when I woke up to get a drink of water really gave me the high jeebas. My first thought was maybe some crackhead tweaking out in the woods, perhaps, but of course my brain immediately goes to cryptids. I can't help it, but what do you think? I've been combing the internet for hours this morning trying to find out legends and myths about this, but I haven't had much luck. So if you know anything, then please do give me some ideas. So I was alone once on a Friday evening during summer, in my house around maybe 2013 to 2016. I really don't remember the exact year, but I was still in my early teens at this time as well, and anyways, usually on Fridays I would go with my parents along with my sister to help them out at their workplace. But well, this Friday they went only with my sister, and I was left alone that day at the house. I was playing Minecraft on my old PC inside my bedroom with my headset on, when suddenly I hear footsteps like someone was rubbing their feet against the carpet in the living room, which is right next to my bedroom. I had the volume really low, so I heard it loud and clear, even through my headphones. I turned my head and looked at my door puzzled and thinking if my parents had come back to get something or maybe my bigger brother had come to the house to grab stuff. I get up from my chair and open my door, but I don't see anyone. The lights are on in the living room, but nobody is there. I go to the front door and the back door, but both are locked. The windows are locked too. I checked the driveway in the front gate and they closed with no cars. There I end up going to every room and turn on the lights and check every corner, even the closet, but there was nothing had been moved or changed. So I go to call my mom and ask her if she had been inside the house. She said no, that they were already at work and suggested that it might have been my brother, but I told her that he hadn't been here either and I didn't hear a couple up or anything. So she just says that I was probably just hearing things, and just to make sure everything is locked, I hang up and triple check everything is locked and walk back to my room absolutely creeped out. Now, I locked the bedroom door, and leave the lights on in my room. I definitely turned up the headphones volume too after that and continued to play. Albeit creeped out till my parents came back from work. To this day, it still really creeps me out thinking about it, especially because that house and property in general has had a history of paranormal activity on it. All of my family, even my skeptic brother and dad, have seen or heard things. At least even my brother's ex-girlfriend has said that she would see or hear things in the house and in the back garage as well. We still live there, but since blessing the house, most of the activity seems to have gone away, which I'm thankful for, but still this house still has me on edge sometimes and I don't like that. 2019 I was 25 and struggling financially. I asked my mom if I could take one of her rooms in order to pay less rent. I moved in and then, soon after, I asked my girlfriend to move in with me to help pay rent. It was a 4-bedroom house with a studio attached in the back. With a small family on one half of our house was my mom in the master bedroom, with one of my twin sisters, Carla, who was 13. It was a 4-bedroom house with a studio attached in the back, with a small family. On one half of our house was my mother in the master bedroom, with one of my twin sisters, Carla, who was 13. In the other room was a man who was renting a room. On the other half of the home was my sister, Janet 19 with her baby daughter, and my other twin sister, Angela 13, and finally, myself and my girlfriend, Kylie. Myself and my girlfriend, aside from some wine or mixed drinks on rare occasions, are completely sober. We are the type to just stay home and watch movies. Really, my Catholic family was fairly poor growing up, and so I like to think of ourselves as just regular, hard-working people. Most importantly, though, we like to think of ourselves as rational. We don't really deal with much nonsense. No previous strange occurrences in any of our lives, and my girlfriend is also a Christian. Now one night at around 8:00 p.m., myself and my girlfriend were in bed, and we were alarmed to hear the most heavy footsteps that you could imagine on the roof. It sounded like a big man with big boots, and it was very clearly going from corner to corner above our room. I got up and went to investigate, but when I did, everything was normal in their house. I went outside expecting to see somebody on our roof, probably the back neighbors, but there was nothing. We asked the people in the back, but they had no clue. Me and my girlfriend in our cat were the only ones that heard it. Apparently too. I thought that maybe it was someone running away from someone or something, but our roof had that very steep triangle shape to it. Anyway, a few days after again, myself and my golfer, and were on our bed, and we heard running above us. This time, though it was quick light, running like a child. This time it was more odd. We went to ask my sisters again, but nothing, which was very strange anyway. Every so often we would hear these steps above us. I started believing that we had a person living in our attic, and every time I heard the steps, I'd pop my head in the attic and shine my phone around, but again nothing. Eventually I climbed all the way up to search too, but again there was nobody up there. Nobody else heard them too, except me and my girlfriend, and it started getting very frustrating. I have anxiety and have always had trouble sleeping. When I'd hear the steps at night, it would be very uncomfortable, and when it would wake me up, I'd have trouble falling back asleep. I started getting very angry at the situation, in fact, and I was a competitive boxer at the time, and sleep was pretty urgent for me. Myself and my girlfriend came to the conclusion that this was probably an animal, or who knows, maybe a ghost. Myself and my girlfriend came to the conclusion that this was probably just an animal. One day, though, I was alone in the house and I heard footsteps. At this point, I was pretty ticked off and I perfectly rushed my way up into the attic. I crawled around saying, "Here I am, I'm all by myself. What are you about? What do you want? Show yourself, do something, etc." But there was nothing. One night footsteps began at around 2 in the morning. I'm awake now and the stress is high. I start doing research on my phone. animal sounds on roof or walls, etc. Nothing sounded familiar, and there was really no help. Ghost making footstep noises apparently, though, equals poltergeist or noisy spirit in German. I researched the history, and they are not ghosts, but energies created by us humans allegedly in the past. They believed polter were caused by teenage girls because of their strong emotions, and that for me was a bingo. My home at the time was a war zone of emotions, anger, sadness, cursing, yelling and fighting. Most of the issues were due to my twin sisters. Angela, especially at the time, was rebelling severely. She started hanging out with some bad kids and drinking and drugging and all that. My mom was strict, so they would fight bad about it, and once they even got into a small fist fight, and the police were called, of course I'd get involved as well. Angela had very strong emotions. I was battling depression at this time due to being broken. Myself and my mom were bipolar. My sister Kla was clinically diagnosed as bipolar, but while researching, learned that we could get rid of negative energy by bringing positive energy like praying or saging your home, etc. Now, eventually, as I was up, my girlfriend woke up as well, and I told her that I heard the footsteps again and couldn't go back to sleep, and I told her about all of the research that I had found. She started doing some research of her own. At this point, it was maybe around 15 minutes before 3:00 a.m., and my girlfriend says out loud, "I'm just waiting for it to be 3 a.m., because apparently that's when spirits are most active or something." I took it as a joke and sort of ignored it, but sure enough at 3:00 a.m. on the dot, we heard the most aggressive, chaotic and sporadic thumping. Yet this time it was happening with no pattern, and it was all over our roof. My girlfriend grabbed my shoulder terrified. I was paralyzed for about 3 seconds because I couldn't believe what I was hearing. After coming back to my senses, I picked up my phone and started recording, but unfortunately it was too late. It must have lasted about 4 seconds or so. All I got on my video was my cat freaking out. The video was saved and recorded at 3:01 a.m. officially, and this was the turning point for me. The next day I went to each of one of my family members, one by one told them what happened in about polter. I also told them about what we had to do to remove this, and I told them that we have to chill out and no more fighting, work on our anger. Let's pray at night together, and thankfully they actually all took it pretty seriously. We dialed her down severely, we saged the house, we prayed and read the Bible passages at night, sometimes together. I proclaimed at our home that there was no room for negative energy, only positive energy here, and we really did a 180 at this point, and amazingly it actually worked. After some time, very suddenly, it just sort of all stopped. Not a peep. We never spoke about it as a family again, and I've been known to be one of the more responsible ones of my siblings. Aside from that time being very hard for me emotionally and financially, I have and am doing very well for myself. Thankfully, honestly too. At the time, I really was the only one of the siblings that would have been able to handle this situation and turn it around like I actually helped do so. I'd like to believe that's the reason why my room was the only ones that heard it. Maybe this occurrence happened in order for my family to be more at peace, or something. Myself and Kylie are now married with a daughter. We moved into our current home on December 15th of 2023. When we settled in, we held hands and I proclaimed loudly to make sure that I was heard that in this house there's no room for negative energy, only positive. My wife did her saging thing too, and put oil on the doorways and prayed and all that, and thankfully so far, so good. My mom and stepdad got married when I was 4. Mom and I moved into the house that my stepdad owned after they got married. It was just the 3 of us and our animals. I'm an only child, and at the sum of the story, we had 2 big dogs who lived inside and out. The dogs usually roamed outside at night on the 20 acres that we owned. The video ends here, but the story continues. Subscribe to us and don't miss the next mysterious chapter.